The question is, why is logic simple and death illogical? So I think the best way for me to introduce you to Wittgenstein, especially this book, Tractatus logico-philosophicus, is that he is the person who is known to have created the truth table. And I think something that's really important and something I learned throughout my classes is like, we should not confuse a representation of reality for reality itself. So anyone who's screaming internally or externally about, logic is just, something that you can't achieve in real life. Like, it's just theoretical, you can't put it into practice. Yeah, but just a small nod to Bergson. Our aptitude for intelligence is exactly what it is that enables us to plan things. So in saying that, when you make your plans for your next trip, you write down the times that works out. You write down where you want to go. You make plans. And the way you make plans most of the time is you look at all this information and you lay it out in front of you and you want to see what's the most optimal. Our intelligence is what enables us to look at every possibility, all the possibilities in front of us. That's exactly the same as the truth table. When something is true, it means that it's possible. If it's false, then it's not possible. And a thing can't be true or false at the same time because it contradicts itself. So when it contradicts itself, it means that I love cats, I hate cats. So which is it? My first and my second, they kind of negate each other. And the other extreme is tautology. So tautology is when you use what you want to prove while proving it. An example would be like, I like green tea because green tea is something that I like. It doesn't tell you anything because whatever you're trying to explain is within the explanation. So between the two extremes of nothing is possible and everything is possible, you have what is possible. Bringing this back full circle, the point is that when something is a representation of reality, it is just an image that we have created, or techniques that we have created, frameworks that we have created to try to make sense of what is reality. You're not saying that one hypothesis or one argument, logical argument, represents the entire reality, because we don't have that. We're finite beings and we don't have a omniscient view of the world. I know this resume is really rapid, and if you need clarifications, feel free to leave them in the comments. But I think it's essential to kind of give you the grasp of what logic is before presenting these two arguments. What's really fun about Wittgenstein in this book, if you can see, it kind of it has numbers and it goes up. I have no idea why the numbers jump from 3.41 to 3.411 and then it goes to 3.42. I'm like, is this abridged? Where's the numbers in between? But what you can see from this is kind of if the idea of logic is that something that 相牵, something that one comes after the other in a logical, necessary way. And also it's kind of like a geometrical reasoning, right? Where it's so we leave we try to leave no nuance for different definitions of things. And you're gonna see why language itself is much more complicated than logic. So the main argument for logic against natural language, which is what we're using, English, French, German, Italian, is that for logic, it is just one way of expressing it. You have numbers and you have this thing representing another thing, and everyone is supposed to be in agreement for exactly what everything means. I'm gonna read you this 4.002 and then I'm gonna add in 4.2211 after to just, nail this point. So why is logic simple, or at least more simple than natural language? L'homme possède la capacité de construire des langues par le moyen desquelles tout sens peut être exprimé, sans qu'il ait une idée de ce que chaque mot signifie, ni comment il signifie. Men possess the capacity to construct languages in a way that all sense can be expressed, without an idea of how and why each word is signified. De même aussi, l'on parle sans savoir comment sont produits les différents sons. The same without knowing how different sounds are produced. La langue usuelle est une partie de l'organisme humain et n'est pas moins compliquée que lui. The usual language is part of the human organism and it is not less complicated than him. Il est humainement impossible de saisir immédiatement à partir d'elle de la logique de la langue. It is humanly impossible to grasp immediately from language the logic of language. La langue déguise la pensée. Language disguises thought, et de telle manière que l'on ne peut, d'après la forme extérieure du vêtement, découvrir la forme de la pensée qui l'habille, car la forme extérieure du vêtement est modelée à de toute autre fin que à celle de faire connaître la forme du corps. So language disguises thought, and in this way that we can't, like according to the exterior form of the clothing, discover the form of the thought that it dresses. So the first part is basically saying that, like, you know, it's because thought is covered up by language, usual language, that we can't actually figure out the form of the thought itself. And then he continues. Car la forme extérieure du vêtement est modelée à de toute autre fin que à celle de faire connaître la forme du corps. So the image that he's creating is that language is the clothing and our physical body is logic. And I mean, like, you look at a person, you can't tell the shape of their body with their clothes on. So think about styling, think about your belts, think about, like, you know, how you change your proportions with like an oversized jacket. This is actually cooler and more fashion than I thought it would be. Anyway, so yeah, think about that. Think about, like, you know, the colors that you put on to kind of, like, you know, get a certain vibe going or get people to react to you in a different way if you want to be sunny. No sun in Paris. But the idea is basically saying that of course we can't get to thought when the whole point of the exterior clothing of language has every other reason other than to actually expose or deliver us the clear form of thought. Les conventions tacites nécessaires à la compréhension de la langue usuelle sont extraordinairement compliquées. So the implicit conventions necessary to understand the usual language are extraordinarily complicated. Yeah. I mean, think about the fact that you can't, well, I can't, explain to people why it is you say something in your maternal language. It's like, you know, you're learning French, you're like, why? And they're like, I don't know. And like Italian, it's just like, non lo so. It's like, I don't know. And you're like, no, I get. Lo, where the F is lo from? Lo is like the, it's like the for, in English, it's a definite article, but it's like specifically for S sounds or Z sounds. And you're like, okay, and then so, and like you're like, where's so from? And then you ask the person and they're like, it's just kind of like that. And you're like, okay, cool. So also like think about, like, you know, the implicit things about language, like what it is that people say and you're like, no, that's not what they meant. And you're like, but literally this is what they're saying. You know, half the time I'm just like, just tell me what you want. Tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. But it's like when people are just like, oh, if you want, or if it pleases you, like, si ça te plaît. And you're like, but if it doesn't please me and I don't do it, but it's actually what you implicitly want, it's not gonna happen. And I know, like, I'm very much against, like, politeness because I think, like, that's why we get disappointed and that's why we have a lot of misunderstandings when we mistake politeness for sincerity. But my other reason for being against politeness is just kind of like the miscommunication. Just tell me. You can do it nicely, you know, there's a tonality to it, but say the words that you mean. This is one of the reasons why logic simplifies things, why logic is simple. And once you understand how logic works, it should be simple. It should be simple in terms of it not being complex, in terms of it being transparent, in terms of it being one-to-one of what you're trying to say. So let's move on to the tiny paragraph that I thought was really, really cute. So the thing is like when I first started epistemology, I was very against it because I was like, but the challenge that I gave myself was like, I'm not gonna make this metaphysical. I really stuck to logic and science, and I learned to really appreciate, you know, what it actually teaches us. So the quote is, Même si le monde est infiniment complexe, de telle sorte que chaque fait consiste en une infinité d'états de choses, et chaque état de choses sont composés d'une infinité d'objets, il faudra quand même qu'il y ait des objets et des états des choses. So even if the world is infinitely complex, in the way that every fact in it has an infinite amount of states of being, so, you know, based on possibilities, right? And within those states of things are composed with an infinite amount of objects. Like, you're just thinking about like how many things do you need to know and how many things that you need to put in place to even get like a picture of what's happening in the state of things. It would still be necessary that there are objects and there are state of things. There's this thing that I read on Vagueness by Bertrand Russell. He said that the idealism of Kant actually created a confusion between what is and knowledge. So long story short, us humans looking at things can be vague, but what is in the state of the world, reality, is what is. It is not vague or precise. So in saying that, we're just like, oh, we never know, science will never get there, logic's not like practice, it's just theory. But the reality and the state of things are the reality and the state of things. Something happened or didn't happen. Whether you are precise or certain or sure about it or vague about it, it did or didn't happen. An object either exists or doesn't exist physically in the world. So the point being here is that just because we don't have 100% certitude on something does not imply that the world is vague. So yeah, that's why like I feel logic is extremely refreshing as well, because like even metaphysics, like, you know, when you think about knowledge, you think about obviously Descartes and like, you know, the doubt. Descartes basically says there's le malin génie, so this being that wants to trick us, and God will never do that. So because there is God, we can arrive at truth. No. Metaphysics, right? Just fluey. Like, kind of makes sense, but like, what do I do with that? In comparison to science and logic, where multiple people can come into agreement about certain statements and certain facts and certain hypotheses, and we can all build towards something. And yeah, like in the end, you can make the argument that a bunch of elites, a bunch of educated experts deciding everything for us, but the other option would just be to not try to come to an objective consensus, not try to, you know, figure things out. So yeah, this is why logic is simple. So moving on to the second one, which is about death, and I know that's why everyone's here and everyone clicked it, so I guess I should deliver. So this is pretty fun because it takes into like 4 steps. So it goes from 6.423 to 6.43 to 6.431 to 6.4311. So let us begin. Du vouloir, comme porteur de l'éthique, on ne peut rien dire. Of will, as the bringer of ethics, we have nothing to say. If you get the book, it talks about the one right before, about ethics. So what it's trying to say is like, we're not here to judge the facts as good or bad. That's not what logic is for. Logic and science is not to tell us why or to give judgments. It's just supposed to identify facts in the world. Et le vouloir comme phénomène n'intéresse que la psychologie. And will as a phenomenon only interests psychology, so nothing to do with logic. Si le bon ou le mauvais vouloir change le monde, il ne peut changer que les frontières du monde, non les faits, non ce qui peut être exprimé par le langage. So if good or bad wants to change the world, they can only change the borders of the world, not the facts, and not what language can express. This is a very like a popular imagery where you just imagine a map. Right? You imagine a map and like there are mountains, rivers. You can't move a mountain, but if you want to make a judgment about the facts, you have to delineate the facts from one another so that you can bring judgment onto it. But having it being good or bad has no effect or no influence of what the thing actually is. En bref, le monde doit alors devenir par là totalement autre. Il doit pouvoir, pour ainsi dire, diminuer ou croître dans son ensemble. So he's saying here that, to be brief, it is that the world has to become something totally different. It has to have the power to diminish or increase in its wholeness. Ah, I just got this. So what he's saying here is that if it is to change, like if good or bad or ethics is to change the world entirely, it has to have the power to either increase or decrease in its wholeness, right? So again, like the facts don't change, but because you manipulate the frontiers, you get a totally different interpretation of what is. So an example that I think of when I look at this is your country, your world, right? If you take like a global aspect of the world, you have a different perception of what life is. But if your perception of life is based on a very reduced amount or a very specific area, your observation or your judgments on life is very different. You imagine this between two people, right? I don't want to say like just affluent and non-affluent area, but it kind of is that, where imagine if you live in an affluent neighborhood where you don't have to worry about safety, where governments, sponsor arts because like necessities aren't very dire, and everything that you do, you feel like there is some kind of support system, either from the government or your family, to achieve more things. And your experience of life or your judgment of life, of the world, is positive. And then the opposite, which is a non-affluent situation where no investments in schools and, government aid is very hard to come by or doesn't exist, or there's just too many steps to even try to apply for one. You don't get much support because everyone is scrambling to pay rent, or everyone is busy trying to survive, that they can't take the time to do philosophy or paint or do these things that are not associated with survival. And that person's view of the world, in contrast, even though like, let's just say like one is a mountain area, one is the sea area, they're both the state of the world. The difference is that the judgments that you make are based on your delineation of what you make on this map of the world. And judgment kind of deforms the world in making us think that this topology is the entirety of the world. And he continues with le monde de l'homme heureux est un autre monde que celui de l'homme malheureux. It's really funny because obviously I read this before, presenting it to you, but I kind of didn't really get that link until just then. But yeah, like in this way you can see that the world of the happy man is another world to that of the unhappy man. So, okay. I'm going to continue about death now. Ainsi dans la mort, le monde n'est pas changé, il cesse. In this way, death, the world doesn't change, it ends. When I read that, I was like, whoa. But then you're like, whoa, why? Like, how do you get from logic and you suddenly talk about death? I'm gonna read the rest of it because if not, then I would just double explain. Okay, continuing on. La mort n'est pas un événement de la vie. On ne vit pas la mort. Death is not an event of life. We do not live death. Si l'on entend par éternité, non la durée infinie, mais l'intemporalité, alors il a la vie éternelle, celui qui vit dans le présent. So if what we mean by eternity is not that of infinite time, but that of intemporality, so therefore eternal life is for those who live in the present. Notre vie n'a pas de fin, comme notre champ de vision est sans frontières. Our life has no end. Like our field of vision, it has no frontier. If we have agreed that logic is a representation of what is in the world, death, therefore, is not logical because it is outside of what is represented in the world. Therefore, death is not logical. Death is non-logic. Death is outside of knowledge. In terms of death, the world does not change like ethics. It ends. Death is not an event in life. It's not a process that we go through in life. And it's not something that can be a phenomenon in life. What logic does is they're putting together links between what either really happened in the world or objects that are in the world. So because death is not lived and death is not an event of the world, you cannot create a link with it. So if we think that eternity is not that, it's like time that continues on forever, but that eternity is non-time, then an eternal life is the person who lives in the present. I don't know, for me, this is extremely profound because we always say there's no present. We always arrive from the past and then, this second's gone, this second's gone, this second's gone. But if you're constantly in the present, you're constantly aware of what you're doing, it is intemporality. Because unless your mind is in the future or in the past, you are present though when you eat something. The flavors are not only condemned to the past or something that you look forward to in the future. The experiences that you have right now is exactly what you're experiencing in the present. As long as you're alive, this is an eternal experience. It doesn't end. It's a continuation of the present. At least according to Wittgenstein, which I think it's kind of crazy. I used to have the prejudice of science and logic is extremely dry. But sometimes when you strip sentiments or emotions or reasonings and all the whys of things and you just look at the facts, it kind of liberates you to actually get to the answers that you're looking for, because you're rid of all the maybes, I'm not sure, it's complicated, ça dépend. Our life has no end, unless you're dead, but while you're alive, it has no end. Like our field of vision, it has no frontier. So, like, think about it. You turn your head and you look around and you see things, and there is no frontier. Like, you can say like you're limited to, you know, like the preys only have like this kind of vision and the predators have this kind of vision. But it's not, there's no frontier. There's no end. Like, if you're gifted with sight, if you're lucky enough to have sight, there's really no barrier. So yeah, I'm gonna leave you with that. Everything is based on interpretation, but it was kind of like the very first time that I saw like such a neutral but legitimate claim for the present. And I found that really moving, especially coming from a logician. But yeah, like, let me know your thoughts if you are as shook as I am. And I hope that you found it helpful. And I wish you a great beginning of your year, because I think this is the last video I'm going to post for this year. And yeah, thank you for dropping by. Bye!